Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Welcome to this very special event. My name is Larry Baranski. I'm the Director of Programs at the Detroit Institute of Arts. This is the first of 4 events that we're doing in conjunction with the exhibit Masterpieces. We are very grateful to Dr. George and Vivian Dean for this exhibit and their support for all of the installation and the programs associated with it. In briefly going over Dr. Dean's, if nothing, certainly prolific career in numerous fields. Certainly just a quick mention of his long career in the medical field. He was a graduate of the Wayne State University School of Medicine. Since the early 1970s, he has been clinical professor at the Wayne State University School of Medicine, Department of Family Medicine. He has served on the medical staff of Grace, Beaumont, and Providence hospitals. In 2002, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award, the American Academy of Family Physicians, and he has endowed a chair for the Department of Family Medicine, University of Michigan School of Medicine, which is just really the brief highlights of really a storied career. In terms of his activity as a collector, I must say from a personal standpoint, those of us who have been on the museum staff for a while were, shall we say, to describe this exhibit as stunning is not to come anywhere near to describing all the levels on which it operates. But I will say that the museum staff was stunned when we realized what it represented. And for those of us, for example, the staff that installed and packed the pieces, or all of the staff of the public relations department who were lucky enough to see the photographs of not just the pieces on display, but all of the many, many pieces in his collection. It was humbling, to say the least. And often in the context of planning exhibits for a museum, we put a great deal of thought into what our outcomes are. But no group of people could ever imagine this outcome. The old litmus test we sometimes use is, does this somehow transcend its medium to become art? But with this collection, we were faced with the prospect of objects that actually transcend art in so many ways because of all the different labels. And in many ways, it's as wonderful as the game of chess itself. Dr. Dean's collection is not a stranger to museum exhibits either. And some of the notable museums that have presented his work have been the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1986, the House of Commons, also in 1986, an exhibit, History of English Chess Sets. In 1992, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris installed his work in an exhibit, Psychology of Chess Set Collecting. In 1994, the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, exhibited in an exhibit entitled Dadaism and Chess. 2004, Madrid, Spain, Chess Sets of the 21st Century. The list really is quite long and amazing. But I'm sure nothing that will compare to the actual story of this collection, which you are now about to hear. So please join me in welcoming Dr. George Dean.
Larry, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for appearing this afternoon. This will be a labor of love for me. I think there are some acknowledgments that I should start my talk with. I'd first like to introduce to you my wife, Vivian. Vivian, would you please stand? In order to amass a collection of this size, it requires a spouse who is willing to spend the time, the energy, and the resources. And I've been blessed with such a wife. And we will celebrate our 57th anniversary in June of this year. I'd like to introduce my daughter, Randy Dean. the best psychiatrist in the Southeast Michigan. Her husband, Sam Stahl, the best corporate lawyer in Southeastern Michigan. My granddaughter, the beautiful Haley Dean Stahl. And my grandson, Noah Stahl. And Ethan Stahl and Leah Stahl. And in the projection booth is my grandson, Joshua Dean Amir, who is filming this talk and is the curator of our collection. My talk today will cover the history of chess, the evolution of chess pieces, and war as a theme for chess sets. Our collecting started 47 years ago. Vivian and I took a trip to the Middle East. We were relatively young. We were relatively poor. We had allocated $200 to spend on gifts for our children, our family, and friends. The first day out, I'm a very bad traveler. I fell right to sleep. Vivian went right down to the boutique. She walked in the boutique, and she saw something she loved. She came right upstairs, woke me up from my sleep, and said, "Come on down." I went down, and there was a Yemenite filigree chess set made of strands of gold and silver encrusted with semi-precious jewels. It was a beautiful work of art. I turned to the owner of the boutique, and I said, "How much is it?" He said, $200. So we shot our wad the first day out. From there on in, every time we would visit a country, we would purchase a chess set to commemorate that trip. And we had collected about 5 or 6 sets, and we ended up in London, in Lansdowne Lane, which is off of Berkeley Square in central London. And we found a shop that sold nothing but chess sets. And the owner of that shop told us that chess was an ancient game played in every country in the world, and that craftsmen had been making chess sets for over 2,000 years, and that museums had chess sets in their collection. There were books written on it, there were auctions, and there were collectors from all over the world. So we got the bug, and we used to go on what I would call chess set safaris. We would identify a country, learn how to say, "Do you have any antique chess sets?" in the language of that country, rent a car, and drive around the country swooping up chess sets. By 1984, we had collected about 300 sets, and we had met many friends around the world, and we would celebrate things with them, they would celebrate things with us, and I wrote a letter to them. I'm a family doctor, and I was an officer in the American Academy of Family Physicians, and once a year we meet in a city in the United States where we hold lectures on scientific subjects, political subjects, and have technical exhibits. And I thought perhaps we could translate that to chess collecting. So I wrote a letter to everybody I knew that collected chess sets, and I said, let's meet in Pompano Beach, Florida, in April of 1984, and let's get together and talk about collecting chess sets. Well, 50 brave collectors from England, from Scotland, from Ireland, from France, from Germany, from Italy, from Bermuda, United States, and Canada met. And we had a great time over 5 days, and we created an organization called Chess Collectors International, and I was elected president. And since that time, we have collaborated with the great museums of the world, the Hermitage, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Pergamon, the Prado, the Historische Museum in Vienna, and it has been a wonderful experience. Now I'd like to start our lecture. In 1969, Vivian and I went on a hunting safari in Africa, and our trackers and our gun bearers and skinners were Maasai warriors. They told me about a gentleman who lived on a 5,000-acre farm who had a chess set. and they knew that I collected chess sets. So we went to visit him. And this was a set we found in Africa. It was secreted out of Russia in 1918 during the revolution. It was a family heirloom. It is made of gold and silver on a board of mother of pearl and marble with semi-precious jewels. It was made in Central Europe, and some of the pieces have enamel. Just to show you, we never know where you're going to find a chess set. In 1977, we got a call from some Russians who had just left the Soviet Union and told us that they had brought out a chess set made by Fabergé. This is a picture of Peter Carl Fabergé, who had a workshop in St. Petersburg and was goldsmith to the czars. His studio produced 200,000 beautiful works of art from 1884 to 1916. And I'd never heard about a chess set. Well, the moment these Russian immigrants called us, we drove to Chicago where they lived, and this was the set that they showed us. It is silver and silver gilt, and the motif of the set is the Assyrians versus the Egyptians. It had the mark of Fabergé on each piece, the Kukushnik or Zolotnik, which shows that it is sterling silver, and the symbol of the master that made this. Armfeld was the name of the master that created this set. It came in a box, an oak box with a silk lining. And on the silk lining was Fabergé, Petrograd, Moscow, London. Well, the Petrograd kind of spooked me. It spooked me because I know that in 1712, Peter the Great created a new capital on the Neva River and called it St. Petersburg. He was a Germanophile, and it remained that capital until 1914 when Russia went to war with Germany. And because St. Petersburg is a German name, the Russians changed the name to Petrograd. So I then knew that the set was made after 1914. And Fabergé was involved in the war effort after 1914, and the shop closed down in 1916. I was a little leery about whether this was a genuine set or not. I asked them if we could take these pieces to London. We were taking a trip to London, and in London was the world's authority of Fabergé. His name is Kenneth Snowman. He has a shop called Wartsky's, which is on Grafton Street. And they allowed us to do this. I remember we went to London. It was in November at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a dark and dreary day. The sun goes down very quickly in London at that time of the year. We walked into the shop, and I said, Kenneth, here is a set purported to be Fabergé. What do you think about it? He looked at the pieces, and he said, I don't know about this, but coincidentally, serendipitously, I just put the only Fabergé chess set in the world that I know about into my exhibition cabinet. I said, could we see it? He said, of course. And here was a set in an oak box with a silk lining, and on the silk was the mark of Fabergé. This time it said St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Odessa. This is in the Cyrillic alphabet. Then I knew that it was made before 1914. And on each piece was a Kukushnik, or the Zlotnik, showing its sterling silver, and the initials of the master, Yarmil Armfeld. The set was made of Calgon jasper, aventurine quartz, squares were Siberian jade, and pale apricot aventine. It was mounted into a silver, sterling silver board with buns at each corner. Well, I said, I'd like to buy the set. And he said, I don't want to sell the set. I said, you don't want to sell it? You're a dealer. You've got the set in your cabinet. I'm an earnest buyer. He said, we just put it in 15 minutes ago. you are the first people to ever see this. And in 2 weeks, I have an article coming out in Apollo and Connoisseur, and I want to wait till that comes out. Well, it took me about an hour to convince him. I said, whatever you're asking for, I'll write you a check. My wife and I are going to Dublin. We're going to Edinburgh. We'll be back in 10 days. My check will have cleared, and you'll wrap up the set, which he did, and we brought that home. The set has a great history to it. In 1904, 1905, Russia had completed the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and there was a great deal of social unrest in Russia. The Tsar Nicholas II's consultant said, you know, in order to divert attention from the social unrest, let's fight a war in the Far East. Manchuria is a pretty nice place, and I think we'd like to take over Manchuria. So Russia decided to take over Manchuria. At the same time, there was a country called Japan that was a budding industrial power and was looking for new markets and a place for raw materials, and they wanted Manchuria. So in 1904, 1905, the Russo-Japanese War, or the Manchurian War, started. It started with the Japanese sinking the Russian fleet in Port Arthur, not much unlike the sinking of our fleet in Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Well, they were losing the war badly, the Russians were, and Tsar Nicholas II's Minister of War was a man called Ilyich Nikolaevich Kuropatkin. He was a great Russian general. And the Tsar went to him and said, I want you to resign as the minister, and I want you to go to Manchuria and win the war. Well, history tells us that the Russians lost the war. In fact, the Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in 1908 in New Hampshire, ended the war. Theodore Roosevelt was the mediator, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for accomplishing this. He was the first American to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. Kuropatkin was a chess player. He came back to St. Petersburg very depressed, and the Tsar, the royal family, and the generals commissioned Fabergé to create this set. And along the perimeter of the board in the Cyrillic alphabet, it says, to our dearly beloved Nikolaevich Kuropatkin for his faithful duty in 1904, 1905 in Manchuria, and all the generals that served with him. Truly a great set, a beautiful set, but with a lot of historical background. Now you might ask, what happened to the other set? When we came back from England after acquiring the Kuropatkin set, we returned the pieces back to the Russians in Chicago. 3 years later, they sold that set at Sotheby's to a friend of ours in Philadelphia. In 2003, Vivian and I purchased this set. So now both sets are in our collection. And I've compared them, and I believe that this also is an authentic Fabergé chess set. Man has been playing board games since Neolithic times. Human beings back 10,000 years ago would draw a square in the dirt and a board, and then put pebbles or stones and play games, board games. 3,300 years ago, King Tutankhamun died at the age of 18 and was buried in the Valley of the Kings. Howard Carter in 1922 excavated that tomb, and in the tomb they found a game of senet, a precursor to chess. It is played on 30 squares with 20 pieces, and the cartouche of Tutankhamun is on the side of the board. These are the pieces that were found in the tomb. They're made of turquoise, they're made of gold, they're made of silver, and they're made of turquoise. In the Valley of the Queen is buried Queen Nefertari. She was the wife of Ramesses II, the pharaoh of the Exodus. And in her tomb, there is a wall painting of her playing the game of senet. The immediate precursor to chess is a game called chaturanga. There are 3 periods in the evolution of chess, from 600 BC to 600 AD, from 600 AD to 1600 AD, and 1600 to the present. In 600 BC, there was a game called Chaturanga played in India. It was on a 64-square board. It had 4 players, and each player had 8 pieces: a Raja, an elephant, a horse, a chariot, and 4 foot soldiers. And it was a game of chance. It was played with the roll of the dice, and that would determine the movement of the piece. However, 600 AD, the game changed dramatically. The 4 players were converted to 2 players, and the 8 pieces on both sides were combined, so now that each player had 16 pieces, and the reducing king became a vizier. Now the player would have a Raja, a vizier, 2 elephants, 2 chariots, 2 knights, and 8 foot soldiers. Another dramatic change occurred. The dice were removed, and it became a game of intellect and strategy and required abstract thinking. Here is an example of a set made in Thailand in the 1800s of teak wood and ivory pieces. It was made during the period of King Mongkut, the famous king of Anna and the king of Siam. It is made of ivory, the pieces are ivory, and if you'll notice on the first rank, the smallest piece is the vizier. This was the weakest piece on the board. It could only move 1 square around the king. The game spread eastward to China, to Indochina, and to Mongolia and Burma, and then it moved westward to Persia. And the Raja of India sent the game to the Shah of Persia and said, "You decipher this game, and you will not have to pay me the tribute you normally pay me each year." And he was able to decipher it. And this Persian miniature depicts the story of that challenge. The game also moved to northwest India with the invasion of the Mughals, who were Islamic. And this is an example of an Islamic set. The Islamic set is made of beryl, which is a form of emerald, and it is encrusted with rubies and diamonds. In Persia, another set was made of marble and jade. Now, in the 8th century, Persia was conquered by the Arabs and the Muslim conquest. The Quran prohibits the creation of anything living in the form of an art. So usually Muslim art is abstract, non-representational. The Arabs moved the game to Baghdad, to Cairo, to Damascus, and across North Africa to Morocco. And this is a Moroccan set from the 18th century, made of threads of gold and silver stretched over a wooden form and balanced on the bottom with a Moroccan coin from the 18th century to give it balance. And the board is a velvet-covered board. This box holds the pieces. This is a traveling set. It was used in caravans that traveled through the Sahara Desert, and at night they would take the box out, open it up, and they would play a game of chess. Well, the Berbers and the Arabs crossed over into the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century and conquered Spain. There were Christians living in the north, and they had interactions with the Arabs and picked up the game of chess. In 1492, the Christians drove the Muslims out of Spain, and they in turn medievalized and Europeanized the game. That's the second period of chess, and now we enter the third period. There was a very dramatic change at that time. The Raja became a king, the vizier became a queen. And whereas the vizier was the weakest piece on the board, the queen became the strongest piece on the board. And one might ask, how did that happen? Well, in Eastern societies and countries, the woman is in such a position in society that she could never lead the country. But in Europe, you had Queen Isabella of Spain, you had Catherine de' Medici in France, you had Elizabeth I in England, and Catherine the Great in Russia, women who were great leaders. And so the queen became the most powerful piece on the board. The horse became the knight, the elephant became the bishop, the chariot became the rook. This was the golden age of chess from about 1600 to about 1800, where the great kings of Europe and the aristocrats and the courtiers would play chess, and authors and playwrights would adopt chess as part of the motif of their works. This is a painting of Miranda and Ferdinand playing chess. It's the fourth act of The Tempest, written by William Shakespeare. It was painted by Ernest Frampton, a pre-Raphaelite painter. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was a Bourbon king and possessed many, many chess sets. One of those being a rock crystal and smoky topaz set on a magnificent board that is displayed in the Louvre Museum at this time. However, in the 19th century, Louis XVIII, one of his successors, lost the queen, one of the queens in this set, so there are only 31 pieces. We have in our collection a rock crystal and smoky topaz set from 1525 that has all 32 pieces. Each piece is capped with either gold or silver. Underneath each square is a tinfoil of gold and silver. And at the corner of each of the square of the board is the turtle, which is symbolic of the slowness of the game. Each piece is jewel-like. Catherine the Great also was a chess player and a collector of chess sets. She loved amber. Amber is a material that occurred 10 million years ago when a tree fell on the Baltic coast, split open, and resin oozed out. The sediment on top of the resin compressed it and made it stone-like. And 90% of the world's amber comes from the Baltic coast. This chess set was made in the workshop of Catherine the Great. And the queen on the far right is a portrait of Catherine the Great. Her king is Gregory Potemkin, her prime minister, and her lover. And the opposing king and queen is Paul I and his queen. The Habsburgs, the rulers of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, also were collectors of chess sets. This set was made in the 19th century by a member of the Habsburg family. It is made of gold and silver, and each piece is different. It's unique. Most chess sets do not have 32 individual pieces. This does. There are heraldic shields around the board, and it's encrusted with precious jewels and semi-precious hard stones. This is the king on the silver side, and you'll notice the king sits under a canopy, and on the far right you'll see a topaz on the top of that canopy, and the artist has created a sculpture which is called an intaglio, which is the opposite of a cameo. Augustus the Strong was the ruler of Saxony and the king of Poland. He loved Chinese porcelain. In fact, he depleted his treasury buying Chinese porcelain, and in 1700, he took his alchemist and said, I've run out of money. I want to buy more Chinese porcelain. I want you to convert lead to gold so I can buy more Chinese porcelain. This guy wasn't stupid. He knew that he couldn't do that. So he went about learning how to make hard-paste porcelain. The Chinese had a monopoly on it up to 1700. He was the first one to make European hard-paste porcelain. His name was Betker, and there was a modeler in his workshop by the name of Candler who created this chess set. It was made in 1740, red and white squares. It was during the Age of Enlightenment. Meissen continues in the tradition of making chess sets. This was designed by Max Esser, chairman of the art department of Berlin University. It has a board with convoluted edges which represent the waves of the ocean, and under the waves of the ocean are the denizens of the sea. The king and queen are the sea anemones, the bishops are lobsters, the knights are seahorses, the rooks are cuttlefish, and the pawns are starfish. Napoleon Bonaparte was an avid chess player. It is said that he played a game of chess before each battle. And there was a cafe in Paris called the Café de Régence. And every great chess player from around the world would come there to play. There's a table and a set of chairs that's in a plaque above that table that says, "Here Napoleon Bonaparte played chess." And on that table sat this chess set for 100 years. It is ivory, it's polychrome. The king is Napoleon, the queen is Josephine, and the king on the opposite side is George III and his queen Caroline. This was given to his brother-in-law, Prince Murat, who was a marshal in the French army and king of Naples. And the family had to part with it in the latter part of the 19th century because they ran out of money and they had a doctor bill to pay, and they gave this chess set to the doctor in lieu of his bill. This set was owned by the royal family of England. It is an 18th century Qing dynasty chess set of ivory. It was given to Queen Victoria, who gave it to her son Edward VII, who gave it to his son George V, and George V gave it to his daughter, the Princess Mary, the Lady of Harewood, who sold it at auction at Christie's in 1950. Alex Hammond, who was a great chess set collector and dealer of chess sets, called this the most incomparable chess set in the world. And this is one of the reasons. There are engravings in each piece, 6 of them, showing scenes from China. There are demons on the shields of the pawns to scare off their opponents. Here's a drape over the elephant. The Medicis also were owners of chess sets and played chess, and this set is from Florence, Italy. One of the popular themes of making chess sets is vice versus virtue, or good versus evil. This is made of ivory. On the virtuous side, the king is upright, and the bishops hold the Holy Bible. On the vice side, the king is Mephistopheles, and the pawns are satyrs. The board is held up by a satyr at the 4 corners, and there are the cherubs that are the pawns on the virtuous side. And there's the bishop holding the Bible, and the bishop on the evil side holding Dante's Inferno. The Italians are also great carvers of marble and of coral. And this is a coral set with yellow and black marble from Siena. The motif is the Europeans versus the Egyptians. In 1750, Louis XV had a mistress called Lady de Pompadour. She was a very intellectual and cultured lady, and she said if the Germans could have a Meissen factory, the French should. So she started Sèvres, which is the leading porcelain company in France. And this set is from Sèvres. It was made in 1922 during the Roaring Twenties. It has an Art Deco motif. And each square, there's a blue square and a white square, and on each white square in gold is drawn a bird, a parakeet, a swan, owls, and various other forms of birds. The British controlled India for 250 years. In 1700, Elizabeth I established the East Indian Company, which exploited India during that period of time. British soldiers were sent to India to keep calm and to make sure that the interests of England were preserved. When a British soldier would finish his term in India, he would then commission a chess set of ivory, bring it home to his home in England, put it on his chest, in his chess cabinet. 1820 to 1840 was known as the Biedermeier period. The Biedermeier period followed the Napoleonic Wars, and Europe looked towards simplicity and whimsical types of art. Chartreuse was a favorite color of the Biedermeier period, and this is a chess set made during that time. It is made of uranium oxide and gold oxide. Uranium oxide radiates. If you put a Geiger counter to this set, you would still have some activity coming from the set. Murano Glass in Venice made this hollow glass set in the 18th century, and each piece has a cork at the bottom, and they used to fill it with liqueurs. And the winner of the match had the choice of drinking the liqueurs, sort of like drinking the blood of their opponent. There's a crystal company in Belgium called Val Saint-Lambert, and this is a set that was made during the 20th century, during the Roaring Twenties, and is one of the most elegant 20th century sets I've ever seen. It's green on one side and clear crystal on the other. Coral is an organic material found in the South Seas of the world. Polypoid animals congregate together in colonies and secrete a calcific exoskeleton. And it comes in white and red and blue, and it's an endangered species because of global warming and the warming of the oceans. This set was made in Japan in the 19th century of orange and white coral. And wood is another very popular material. This is a set that belonged to a Danish king and sat in his castle in the island of Marquard for 100 years. In 1915, a group of artists met in Zurich, Switzerland. They were disenchanted and upset with the governments and societies that had created the horrors of World War I. And they decided that they were going to create a new school of art. They opened up a dictionary, they put their finger on a word, it was a French dictionary, and their finger rested on Dada, which means hobby horse in French, and they called themselves the Dadists. The leader of the Dadists was Marcel Duchamp, one of the great artists of the 20th century. He was a great chess player also. In fact, he gave up his career being an artist to play chess for the French national team, and in front of him sits a chess set made by Max Ernst. He took a urinal, put it on the wall, and painted the word mute, which was an anonymous name, and this hangs in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It was noted as one of the 10 greatest works of art of the 20th century, if you want to believe that. Well, without him, you wouldn't have pop art. You wouldn't have had Warhol, you wouldn't have had Lichtenstein, because he was a seminal artist who stimulated them to look externally at everything in the world, and everything in the world was art, and everything was beautiful. There's a gentleman called Emanuel Rudnitsky who was born in Philadelphia and moved to Paris, where he changed his name to Man Ray. and he was a great friend of Marcel Duchamp. And as an homage to Duchamp, he created this chess set of bronze and bronze gilt on an enamel board with a poem about each piece circling the board. In 1919, Walter Gropius created a new school of art in Weimar, Germany, called the Bauhaus School. He brought together artists and architects, and their goal was to create simplicity and functionality. This chess set was made in 1924 by Joseph Hertwig, who was head of the wood department in the Bauhaus School, and each piece is a functional piece. If you'll notice in the middle, the cube represents the rook because it moves horizontally and vertically. The X represents the bishop because it moves diagonally, and that L-shaped piece represents the knight because it has a perpendicular move. Salvador Dali was a Dadaist and then became a Surrealist in 1923 when Dadaism sort of dissipated. The Surrealists were the exact opposite of the Dadaists. They, instead of looking externally to the outside world, they looked internally to the unconscious mind, and they had dreamlike paintings. They were influenced by Freudian psychology. This is Persistence of Memory, one of Dali's great masterpieces, which resides in MoMA in New York. Well, he also created a chess set as an homage to Marcel Duchamp, but he was kind of an idiosyncratic individual. He took his fingers and he took casts of his fingers, his thumb, his index finger, his middle finger, ring finger, and little finger, and he had a tooth that he had lost at the age of 3, and he took that tooth and he put it on top of the king and the queen. It's made of silver and silver gilt. Now, war has been a theme for chess sets for the past 2,000 years. Unfortunately, mankind has engaged in wars and battles during that period of time. And chess is a war game, so it naturally would follow. This chess set is of ivory, and what it does is commemorates the Punic Wars. The Punic Wars were fought in 300 BC in the Mediterranean. Rome was a leading country of that time, and Carthage was a leading country of that time. The leader of Carthage was Hannibal. Hannibal wanted to conquer Sicily, so he took his army across the Mediterranean and took a troop of elephants and came down through the northern part of Italy, through the Alps, marching these elephants over the Alps, which is quite a feat. But he lost the battle to Scipio Africanus. And Rome would then be the dominant power in the Mediterranean for the next 800 years. This chess set was made to commemorate that war. Hannibal is the king on the dark side. Scipio Africanus is the king on the Roman side. In 500 AD, Clovis ruled France. And by the way, this set is purported to have been commissioned by Louis XV and given to his mistress, Madame de Pompadour. It is ivory and polychrome. The king is Clovis. His bride is Clothilda, who converted him to Catholicism. And they decided to go on a crusade of defeating the peripheral tribes around France and converting them to Catholicism. Well, they beat them and the Alamanis at a battle in 500 AD, and they converted them to Catholicism. However, they still practiced their pagan ways. So the artist who created this chess set has a two-faced bishop. On the front, you see a priest, but on the back, you see the devil on the back of him. The knights on the French side are St. Martin dividing his cape to cover the naked beggar, and St. George slaying the dragon. And this is the king and the queen on both sides, and made of polychrome and ivory. In 1099, Urban II was Pope. He challenged the kings of Europe to form armies, go to the Holy Land, and reconquer the Holy Land from the Muslims. In 1189, Henry II died and was succeeded by his son, Richard the Lionhearted, who immediately formed an army and sailed to the Middle East, won a battle in Acre, won a battle in Jaffa, and then he met Saladin the Great, who had conquered Jerusalem in 1187, and a stalemate occurred. An armistice was called, and Richard the Lionhearted and Saladin became very friendly with each other. In fact, they proposed a marriage between Richard's sister and Saladin's brother. Richard became sick one time, and Saladin sent his court physician to mentor to his medical needs. That court physician was Maimonides, the famous Hebrew philosopher. This chess set was made in France. It is of porcelain, polychromed, and it has Saladin the Great as the king on one side and Richard the Lionhearted, the king, on the other. His queen is Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was his mother. In the 13th and 14th centuries, there were religious wars fought between the Holy Roman Emperor on the left side and the Pope next to him as to who would control the Catholic Church. Holy Roman Emperor was German. This chess set was made, it's a propaganda set because it was made by a German. You'll see that the white side is the Holy Roman Emperor, the black side is the Pope. Look at the Queen. She is bare-breasted. She pulls up her dress to show her legs, a very immodest thing. The knights also show the preference for the Holy Roman Emperor. The Queen rides a side saddle on a horse very appropriately, while the knight on the Pope's side is a cherubic monk with 2 casks of wine. The Ghibellines were on the side of the Holy Roman Emperor. The Guelphs were on the side of the Pope. The story of Romeo and Juliet is not a story about the Hatfields and the McCoys. It really is a story about the Ghibellines versus the Guelphs. And this chess set was made in the 17th century. All 32 pieces are different. The pawns represent the different trades that were present during that period of time. At the end of the 15th century, the English were involved in what was called the War of the Roses. The Lancasterians were fighting the Yorkists. The symbols of the Yorkists and the Lancasterians was the red rose and the white rose. Therefore, it was called the War of the Roses. Richard III became king. He was a Yorkist, but Henry Tudor of Wales defeated him very shortly after he assumed the kingship and became Henry VII. He died in 1510, and Henry VIII, his son, became king. Henry VIII was a very imposing individual physically and psychologically, and he was married to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. She provided him with a daughter, Mary Tudor, who will become Bloody Mary. But he wanted a son, so he annulled the marriage, divorced himself from the Catholic Church, and created the Church of England. He then married Anne Boleyn, who also provided him with a daughter, who would become Elizabeth I, one of the great monarchs of England, but she could not provide him with a son, so he had her beheaded on trumped-up charges of incest and adultery. He then married Jane Seymour, who provided him with a son, Edward VI, and the Queen, and this is Jane Seymour. On the opposing side is Francis I, the leader of France. They had a meeting, Francis I and Henry VIII, in France in 1520 called the Field of Cloth, where Henry challenged Francis I to a wrestling match, and he lost. This chess set was made to commemorate that field of cloth meeting in France in 1520 of polychromed porcelain, fired in Germany, with Henry VIII as king on one side and Francis I on the other. By the way, Catherine de' Medici married one of his sons and brought Leonardo da Vinci to Paris to live with her, and he brought the Mona Lisa with him. And Francis I purchased the Mona Lisa from him, and it resides in the Louvre because of his purchase. In 1572, France was 2/3 Catholic, 1/3 Protestant. Catherine de' Medici was a devout Catholic. She went about killing off the leaders of the Huguenots in the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and eventually the Huguenots, who were the Protestants of France, would flee. In fact, the Fabergé family was a Huguenot family that fled to Russia in the 17th century. This set is made of ivory and of amber, a very unique combination. And it was done in the 17th century, and the costumes show the actual wear of clothing that was worn during that period of time. Here's an example of the bishop wearing the clothing of the 17th century. And the queen, the Amber Queen, is Catherine de' Medici. Her king is the Joan of Arc. In 1756, there was a 7-year war between England and France. In the United States, it was called the French and Indian War. It was a very important war. The British won, and because of that, they assumed control of Canada. George Washington fought on the British side and was instrumental in helping them win the war. He applied for a commission in the English army, but they would not give it to him because he was a colonist. George would never forget this. George III was king of England, and his coffers were depleted because of the war, so he began to tax the colonists to fill up his coffers again. But they were very upset because they were not represented in the English Parliament, and the call through the colonies was no taxation without representation. So in 1774 and 1775, a Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia. Patrick Henry rose and said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And in 1776, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and the American Revolutionary War occurred. George Washington was named General of the Army and fought 8 years bravely, tenaciously, and desperately to beat the British. And finally, in 1783, he defeated Cornwallis at Yorktown. Now, there are theories about who was the greatest president of the United States. Some people say it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Some people say it was Lincoln, whose 200th birthday we just celebrated. My vote goes for George Washington. He tenaciously fought the war and won it so we could become a nation. He was offered the kingship, and he turned the kingship down. He said, "No, I will be a president. I will run for 2 terms, and then we will transfer the government democratically by election." So he set the tone for that. And in fact, when George III heard that George Washington had turned down the kingship, he said, "This must be the greatest man in the earth." This chess set was created by a bicentennial committee celebrating the 200th anniversary of the American Revolutionary War. George III is the king on the English side, George Washington the king on the American side. Well, in 1789, the French were aware that that America had defeated a great power like England, and besides that, the French helped us win the American Revolutionary War and depleted the treasury of King Louis XVI. So he began to overtax his people. They finally got upset with that, and for other reasons, they overthrew the government in the French Revolution. They beheaded King Louis XVI, and they fought off the nations of Europe who were very upset because of this regicide. Well, one of the great officers in the French army during the 1790s was Napoleon Bonaparte, who was from Corsica and was of an Italian descent. He was such a great general that he took the government over in 1799 and coronated himself as Emperor of France in 1804. He then went about defeating all the armies of all the countries of Europe and, in essence, controlled Europe after that time. In 1810, he had not had a son. He was like Henry VIII. He wanted a son to succeed him. He was married to Josephine. Josephine was barren and could not provide him with a son, so he divorced her, even though he loved her very much, and he married Marie Louise, who was the daughter of Francis I, the Holy Roman Emperor. This chess set was commissioned by his nephew, Napoleon III, and that's the crest of Napoleon on the top of that chess set. And the set has Napoleon as the king, Marie Louise as the queen, and Francis I as the king. It is made of ivory, and it is polychromed. Well, Napoleon had put an embargo on trade with Europe and England, but Russia continued to trade with England. Besides that, Napoleon really wanted to marry the sister of the Tsar of Russia, but he would have nothing to do with this upstart Corsican artillery officer, and he refused that marriage. Napoleon was very upset, so in 1812, he mustered an army of 500,000 people and invaded Russia. Alexander I named a man called Mikhail Kutuzov as general, and they practiced a scorched earth policy. Napoleon miscalculated the vastness of the steppes of Russia and the harshness of the Russian winter, and like his predecessors and successors, when he reached Moscow in September, the Russian winter began to set in. He was not prepared for that because he thought the Russians would give in and surrender, and he lost 450,000 of the 500,000 that invaded Russia. After that, he never was able to attain the status that he had before that invasion. This chess set was made by a Russian. It's ceramic, and it commemorates the War of 1812. There was a library of imperial armies in England that created this chess set to commemorate the Battle of Waterloo. It is made of pewter and hand-painted. And Napoleon is the king on one side, and the Duke of Wellington is the king on the other. Back in the United States in 1860, the United States had grown to 31 states with 31 million people. The North was industrialized, anti-slavery, pro-tariff. The South was pro-slavery, agrarian, and anti-tariff. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1960, the South became very upset about that. They thought that he ran on an anti-slavery program, and so 11 states would secede, and in April of 1861, the Confederacy was created, and Beauregard fired on Fort Sumter, and America would enter the bloodiest war it has ever fought. That's Abraham Lincoln, and his queen piece is Ulysses S. Grant. Jefferson Davis, who was the king here, became president of the Confederacy. The war was fought for 4 years, but in April of 1865, Robert E. Lee, who was the queen piece, surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant on April the 9th, 1865, And 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by Booth. This chess set was made by a Russian artist in Russia who has done a marvelous job of capturing the portraits of all the famous people from the Civil War. And the pawns are all the great generals that served with them, including Stonewall Jackson and William Tecumseh Sherman. Now we enter the 20th century. In June of 1914, the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. He was the pretender to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria had a treaty with Germany. Serbia had a treaty with Russia. Russia had a treaty with England and France. And in August of 1914, World War I would occur. This chess set, made of pear wood and boxwood, was made by a prisoner of war in a prisoner of war camp to curry favor with the commandant of that camp. The lady is the queen, she is Germania. The king is Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the bishops are Ludendorff on the right, who was involved with Hitler in the putsch in 1923, and Paul von Hindenburg on the left, who was president of Germany and named Hitler as chancellor in 1933. On the French side is Marianne, who represents liberty. In fact, our Statue of Liberty is patterned after her. And the king is Poincaré, the president, and the two bishops are Joffre and Foch. And there is the set, a very attractive and very finely carved wood set with a historical background. In 1923, Benito Mussolini was the ruler of Italy, the fascist ruler, and he had delusions of grandeur of recreating the Roman Empire. He had his eyesight on Ethiopia. The leader of Ethiopia was Haile Selassie, who called himself the Lion of Judah. He traced his heritage all the way back to the Queen of Sheba, who was married to King Solomon. Well, Italy was a very modern technological nation, and they defeated Haile Selassie, which was a primitive, from Ethiopia being a primitive country, in a very short time. He went to the League of Nations, Haile Selassie, and asked them to please intercede. They refused. The League of Nations then collapsed, and in September the 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland and World War II would occur. And this chess set was commissioned by Alex Hammond in 1936 by an artist called Joseph Barkin. It is ivory, and it is very finely carved, showing Benito Mussolini as the king on one side and Haile Selassie, the king, on the Ethiopian side. America entered World War II in December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. I commissioned this set by a carver in Pennsylvania. It is wood and painted with multiple colors. The pawns are various elements of the Axis and Allied armies. The king is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The queen is Eleanor Roosevelt. The bishops are Churchill and Stalin on the Allied side. Hitler is the king on the Axis side. Elsa Braun is the queen, and Benito Mussolini and Hirohito are the bishops. In 1946, Churchill came to this country and in Fulton, Missouri, gave a speech in which he said, "From Stettin on the Baltic in the north to Trieste in the Adriatic in the south, an iron curtain has fallen over Europe." And that was the beginning of the Cold War. Vladimir Lenin, who led the Soviet Revolution in Russia, created a school of art called social realism, which extolled the virtues of the communist revolution. And a chess set was made to commemorate that in the 1920s. It was made by the Danko sisters. It was called Communism versus Capitalism, Red versus White, but it's really a propaganda set. And here is why it's a propaganda set. On the communist side, you have a blacksmith with his hammer. The queen holds a sheath of wheat. The bishop is a colonel in the Red Army. The hammer and sickle is on the sail of the rook, and in Russian sets, the rook is a boat. And the pawn is a farm worker with a sickle facing to the left. This is the capitalist side. The king is a skeleton draped in ermine holding a femur. The queen is bare-breasted. She holds a cornucopia of gold. The bishop is a guard in the imperial guard of the czars. The chain and the axe of the executioner is embossed on the sail of the rook, and the pawn is a worker in chains, looking peaked, facing to the right. A very clever set. Well, this is the last set. In 1954, the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu by Ho Chi Minh, and France retired from Indochina. Dwight D. Eisenhower sent American military advisors to create an integrity of the South Vietnam and to protect them. John F. Kennedy continued that until he was assassinated in November of 1963, on November 22nd, and Lyndon Baines Johnson became President of the United States and eventually would send 500,000 Americans to Vietnam, where 50,000 would be killed. This brought down his presidency. This set was created by Myrna Goldberg, who was an art student in Ann Arbor, and it is called The Doves versus the Hawks. On the hawk side, LBJ is the king, Lady Bird is the queen, Ronald Reagan is the bishop, Richard Nixon is a bishop, Dean Rusk is the knight, and so is Hubert Humphrey. On the dove side, Martin Luther King is the king, Joan Baez is the queen, Bertrand Russell, William Fulbright are the bishops, and Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy are the knights. And there is a set with the pawns being all doves on one side and hawks on the other. Thank you very much once again for your attention. To those of you who want to see the exhibition, you can go up the stairs to the right and then go through the Great Hall and turn to your right. But for those of you who can't take the steps, there's an elevator that will take you to the first floor. And I will be up there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.